Ich möchte Sie sehr herzlich zur Podiumsdiskussion Feministische Strategien gegen Neoliberalismus und Nationalismus im Namen von WIDE, dem entwicklungspolitischen Netzwerk für Frauenrechte und feministische Perspektiven, und dem VIDC, Vienna Institute for International Dialogue and Cooperation, begrüßen. Ich bin Claudia Thalmeier und arbeite als Koordinatorin bei WIDE. Als Frauennetzwerk beobachten wir die Zunahme des Rechtspopulismus und autoritärer Bewegungen in Österreich, in Europa und international mit sehr großer Besorgnis. Wir wissen sehr gut, dass Frauenrechte überall dort, wo nationalistische, rechtspopulistische, rechtsextreme oder religiös-fundamentalistische Bewegungen einen Aufschwung nehmen, als erstes attackiert und zurückgenommen werden. Besonders im Kreuzfeuer stehen dabei die sexuellen und reproduktiven Rechte von Frauen und Mädchen und damit ein zentraler Aspekt der Selbstbestimmung von Frauen. Nationalismen, Rechtspopulismen und Fundamentalismen haben aus unserer Sicht gemeinsam, dass sie autoritäre Antworten auf Arbeitslosigkeit, hohen Konkurrenzdruck, Verunsicherung und eine weit verbreitete Perspektivlosigkeit sind, die die wirtschaftliche Globalisierung unter neoliberalen Vorzeichen mit sich gebracht hat. Man kann sicher nicht allein die Ökonomie für politische Entwicklungen verantwortlich machen, aber aus unserer Sicht hat schon eine vor allem an den Interessen großer Unternehmungen orientierte Weltwirtschaftspolitik in den letzten Jahrzehnten zu unfassbarer sozialer Ungleichheit geführt, zu ökologischen Desastern und zu einer Prekarisierung der Lebensverhältnisse sehr vieler Menschen. Die Verunsicherung und Angst vor sozialem Absturz befeuern nationalistische autoritäre Bewegungen. Und hier ist auch die Europäische Union bzw. die in ihr organisierten versammelten Nationalstaaten in die Verantwortung zu nehmen. Denn neoliberale Politik, als Stichwort Austerität, als Antwort auf die Bankenkrise, massive soziale Spannungen in Europa erzeugt hat. Gegenüber einem Europa als gemeinsamen Wirtschafts- und Währungsraum ist die Demokratisierung der EU nur langsam vorangeschritten und womöglich zu langsam. Die populistischen Antworten sind nicht zuletzt deshalb so problematisch, weil bestimmte Gruppen zu Feindbildern erklärt werden und ihre Ausgrenzung betrieben wird. Sie gehen durchwegs mit einem sehr konservativen Frauenbild einher, auch wenn sich in letzter Zeit Frauen als Führungspersönlichkeiten sehr weit rechts stehende Bewegungen auffinden. Mit dieser heutigen Diskussion, mit dieser heutigen Veranstaltung knüpfen wir auch an Diskussionen an, die wir letzten Herbst im Rahmen einer gemeinsamen Konferenz des europäischen WIDE-Netzwerks, gemeinsam mit der European Women's Lobby, geführt haben, bei der der Aufwärtstrend rechtspopulistischer Bewegungen und der gesellschaftliche Backlash vor dem Hintergrund von Flucht und Migration nach Europa ein zentrales Thema war. Der Aufschwung rechter Bewegungen in Europa und in der Welt hat unmittelbar negative Folgen auf die Entwicklungschancen der Bevölkerung in ärmeren Ländern, insbesondere der Frauen. Nicht zufällig war eine der ersten Amtshandlungen von Donald Trump als US-Präsident die Wiedereinführung der Global Gag Rule in den USA, das heißt die Streichung der Förderung für Familienplanungsprogramme, wovon Millionen Frauen und Mädchen nicht nur in den USA, sondern auch in Entwicklungsländern betroffen sind. Trotz oder gerade angesichts des bevorstehenden gesellschaftlichen Backlashs ist es wichtig und möglich, an die Stärken von Frauenorganisationen und Frauenbewegungen anzuknüpfen. Ich möchte daran erinnern, dass zum Beispiel bei der Stichwahl zum österreichischen Bundespräsidenten, wo sich verschiedene Bruchlinien in der Gesellschaft gezeigt haben, gab es auch eine Bruchlinie zwischen den Geschlechtern und Frauen haben sich zu gut 60% für den grünliberalen und gegen den rechtspopulistischen Kandidaten entschieden. Oder als Donald Trump in den USA sein Amt angetreten hat, waren es Frauen, die einen Marsch auf Washington organisiert haben und dafür unglaublich viele Menschen mobilisieren haben können. Es wird geschätzt, dass über 2 Millionen weltweit auf die Straße gegangen sind und sichtbar in Opposition getreten sind. Und mit der heutigen Veranstaltung wollen wir Strategien von Frauen in verschiedenen Regionen der Welt aufzeigen, die sowohl gegen den Neoliberalismus als auch gegen nationalistische und rechtspopulistische Bewegungen engagieren. In allen Ländern gibt es feministische Organisationen und Menschen, die für eine andere Welt eintreten und die die Frauen- und Menschenrechte tatsächlich für alle, nicht für eine bestimmte privilegierte Gruppe, das gültig ansehen. Wir freuen uns sehr, dass wir für die heutige Diskussion 3 Referentinnen aus verschiedenen Ländern bzw. Regionen gewonnen begonnen haben, ihre Erfahrungen, ihre Analysen und Vorschläge für feministische Strategien gegen Neoliberalismus und Nationalismus mit uns teilen. Nadia Schuster wird auf den Abend führen und auf das Podium vorstellen. Ich darf Nadia Schuster vorstellen. Sie ist Soziologin und Feministin, arbeitet seit 2011 am VDC im Bereich Gender zu Themenschwerpunkten wie die Gendersensibilisierung von Mädchen und Burschen für das Erreichen von Geschlechtergerechtigkeit, im Bereich Bekämpfung von Menschenhandel, zu Migration und Entwicklung und zu Politikkohärenz im Interesse von Entwicklung. Sie ist außerdem Redakteurin von Spotlight, das ist das VDC Online-Magazin, und sie arbeitet für den Parlamentarischen Nord-Süd-Dialog, wo es darum geht, das österreichische Parlament mit afrikanischen Parlamenten zu vernetzen und Kontakte und Partnerschaften aufzubauen. Im September letzten Jahres hat Nadia an einem internationalen Forum von AWID teilgenommen. AWID ist die Association for Women's Rights and Development. In Brasilien hat dieses große internationale Frauentreffen stattgefunden und sie sagt, das hat ihre Arbeit sehr inspiriert und ihren Glauben an die Gestaltungsmacht von intersektioneller feministischer Kollektivität gestärkt. Und Nadia hat aus Brasilien auch wesentliche Ideen für die heutige Veranstaltung mitgebracht. Bevor ich jetzt das Wort übergebe, darf ich mich an dieser Stelle auch bei unserer Fördergeberin bedanken. Das ist die Austrian Development Agency, die die Arbeit von VDC fördert. Und noch zwei organisatorische Anmerkungen. Die Diskussion wird auf Englisch stattfinden und wir haben eine Simultan-Dolmetschung. Ich sage vielen Dank an Gabriele Gallo und an Thomas Musil. Und Sie finden Headsets, wenn Sie sie noch nicht genommen haben, im Eingangsbereich da links. Das ist vielleicht ganz gut, eine zusätzliche Unterstützung zur Verfügung. Und auf den Stühlen sind Feedbackbögen ausgelegt. Bitte nach der Veranstaltung ausfüllen und in die Boxen im Eingangsbereich werfen. Das ist eine Hilfe, um die Veranstaltung zu übertreiben. Ich darf Nadia das Wort geben und ich wünsche eine anregende Diskussion.
Vielen Dank, Claudia, für diese gute Einführung ins Thema. Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, liebe Mitstreiterinnen, auch ich möchte Sie im Namen von VEDC und WIDE recht herzlich zu dieser Podiumsdiskussion begrüßen und ich werde, wie bereits angekündigt, jetzt auf Englisch fortfahren. So, dear ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the VEDC and WIDE to this panel discussion. Before introducing our distinguished guests from Vienna, but also from far away, I would like to thank Peter Köln and Marlina Schadmüller from Westlicht of this great photo museum, because I think there is also a linkage that can be built between the topic of today and the importance and role of photography in documenting history and social protests. Because every year the World Press Photo Exhibition takes place here, and I'm quite sure that this year it will also display images of the Women's March on Washington, which many of you might have witnessed, also probably not in person, but through media or social media. And thereby, I think photography can also sensitize men and women alike, and in particular the young generation, which is very important for making progress and for fighting backlashes. So therefore, I'm very glad to be here. Thanks again to Westlicht. Allow me to say a few words about the structure of today's discussion. So first, we will have 3 short inputs, and I will be pretty strict on time management because I would also like to give you the opportunity to pose questions or make comments or come up with your ideas, which is very critical for us. And after the short inputs, I will pose 1 or 2 questions to our guests, and then we will have the Q&A session. But now it's time to welcome our panelists. So I would like to start with Birgit Sauer, to the right here, from the University of Vienna. And then we have Kate Lapin, here to my left, from the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development, which is based in Chiang Mai, Thailand. And to my close right, we have Virginia, I hope I pronounce it correctly.
Perfect.
Virginia Lopez Calvo from the online platform We Move Europe, which is based, if you can say so, in Brussels. Or no,
we're based everywhere but in Brussels.
Okay, sorry. And I think they deserve an applause. Mm-hmm. I will introduce each speaker in more detail before they are going to give their inputs, and I would like to start with Birgit Sauer. She's a renowned professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Vienna already since 2006. Birgit Sauer works in an international academic work environment and migrated also to different countries for her teaching. So, for instance, she was visiting professor at the Konkuk University in Seoul, Korea, at the University of Mainz in Germany, at the Florida Atlantic University in Boca Raton in the USA, and many others. Her main research areas are critical studies of governance and the state, politics of gender, equality policies, politics of emotion, as well as right-wing populism. With regard to the latter, together with Stefanie Meyer and Edmar Djanovic, she published a very interesting article, academic article, in which they analyzed how gender is framed in the right-wing populist discourse in Austria. And she will present some of these findings also in her lecture, small lecture. Professor Sauer participated also in 2 EU-funded projects on right-wing populism and racism. So she will provide us with a accurate political science analysis and bring in her broad intersectional knowledge, which I really appreciate. Thank you very much for sharing your views with us. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, dear friends, good evening. So it's my task to introduce a more broad view on the context, on the political context, especially on right-wing populism and so-called anti-genderism in Europe. So the success of right-wing populist or extremist parties in terms of elections, but also in terms of political agenda setting, is a challenge to European democracies, and this is, of course, widely known. So, and just to give you a few examples, I would say, despite the loss of the presidential election, the Front National in France has developed into a major actor in France, as have, for instance, the Danish People's Party or the United Kingdom Independent Party, as well as the Austrian Freedom Party, the FPÖ. And Germany, for a long time, seemed to be a sort of immune against these strategies, which are primarily based on anti-immigrant or anti-Muslim policies, but more recently the success of the so-called Alternative for Germany proved that this is no longer the case. So what unites all these right-wing populist parties, despite of their different ideological backgrounds might be, is a specific worldview, and this worldview hinges on a double antagonism. And the first antagonism is this which says, well, it's we against the political elite, the ruling elite, which is sometimes called the establishment, or it could be the European Union or Brussels, or, for instance, mainstream media. And the second antagonism is an opposition of the we against the others. And these others might be immigrants, asylum seekers, or Muslims. So both the elites and the so-called others are allegedly posing a threat to the people, a threat to the autochthonous population. And of course, in this respect, in this antagonistic political style, Donald Trump must also be qualified as a populist. And since the turn of the century, right-wing populist parties across Europe join a discursive alliance against the concept of gender. That means against gender studies, but also against gender mainstreaming. And the notion of gender, or how those actors call it, gender ideology, is a specific misinterpretation, or we could also say a specific interpretation of the deconstructivist, feminist, and queer theory on gender. So these so-called anti-genderism, that's how they somehow label themselves, is always combined with an anti-feminist move, and of course with sexism. And of course here Donald Trump is a good example for this move. So the terms gender, ideology, and anti-genderism were not coined by Donald Trump or the FPÖ, but they were coined by the Catholic Church as a response to the United Nations conferences, for instance, the Cairo Conference of Population in 1994, and of course then the Beijing Women's Conference in 1995. The Catholic ideological position against the gender concept has been consolidated at the beginning of the new millennium with a series of publications. And you just see one of these population, the document with the title Family, Marriage and De facto Unions of the year 2000, which was published by the Pontifical Council of the Family. So this document first summarized the Catholic anti-gender position. And this position, although coined quite some time ago, is still valid today, and Pope Franciscus is still propagating this anti-gender position. So this global Catholic discourse against gender aims at a critique, of course, of sexual diversity, and especially homosexuality, and it combines this critique with the Catholic struggle against reproductive rights of women and against abortion. And this anti-genderist struggle of the Catholic Church was boosted at the beginning of the new millennium when, for instance, evangelical groups in the USA joined this debate, but also the Russian Orthodox Church. So we have a global coalition against gender. And one typical actor in this is the World Council of Families, you see also on the PowerPoint. And this council is again a transnational network founded in 1995 by actors from the USA and by actors from Russia. And today this World Council of Families is the largest anti-LGBT organizations in the world. And participants in the Congress of the World Council of Families, they come from all over the world, but just to give you one name is Gabriele Kubi, and Gabriele Kubi is a German, one of the most important German anti-gender activists. She gave a talk at the World Council's conference, and her book, you see the book here in German, the book Gender Revolution, Relativism in Action from the year 2006, contributed very much to the popularization of the anti-gender discourse in the German-speaking countries. And this book by Gabriele Kubi also inspired an Austrian book, the book by the FPÖ politician Barbara Rosenkranz. I couldn't translate the title Menschinnen, but the subtitle is Gender Mainstreaming Towards a Sexless Human Being, published in 2008. So these are just two examples, German-speaking examples, of this anti-gender and mainly right-wing anti-gender discourse. So this anti-gender motive is a sort of ideological glue which joins together rather different and sometimes antagonistic groups, such as the Christian conservatives, for instance, groups of the religious, but also of the or anti-religious political right. In Austria, for instance, we identified in our research 5 clusters of actors which join in this anti-gender movement. And just to give you a little bit of an insight, the first cluster are groups with a right-wing background. This is, of course, the Freedom Party of Austria, but it's also the identitarian movement, which joins the anti-gender debate. The second cluster are more right-wing conservatives, these right-wing conservatives, different, for instance, from the FPÖ, which is anti-religious. The right-wing conservatives, they are connected to the Catholic Church. Then, of course, the third cluster are Catholic organizations, huger ones, smaller one, for instance, the Christian Party, but also the Association Human Life International or Youthful Life. These are more Catholic anti-abortion movements. The fourth cluster are so-called groups for men's and fathers' rights, which claim the rights for fathers. And then the fifth cluster, are groups of so-called they call themselves concerned parents, and they mobilize against sexual education or the use of gender-sensitive language at schools. So this common rejection of gender allows these rather different groups to organize, for instance, joint public events, and what they do, they organize the so-called marches for the family against the gay prides in Austria and especially in Vienna. So, and in the following, I just would like to sketch out some of the main arguments of these groups, which they frame in the anti-gender discourse. And I want to argue that gender in their debate works as a sort of empty signifier. It might be used for everything. It is something, whenever you use gender, you have a sort of chain of equivalence, is a chain where of association, where you can put in everything that you are against, for instance, against abortion, against LGBT rights, against feminism, or against equality policies, for instance, and of course, against immigration. So overall, the anti-genderism can be used for an antagonistic mobilization of a we against the others, and thus this anti-gender discourse feeds well into right-wing populist mobilization. So just to give you some insights into the main arguments and frames of the anti-gender discourse, of course, first of all, they claim that the gender binary is natural and that this natural gender order is endangered by gender studies or by feminists. The second frame is that this gender ideology threatens the heterosexual family, and this heterosexual family, of course, is mainly challenged by same-sex marriage, for instance, and this is a danger not only to the family itself, but of course to the nation or to the state, because in the right-wing populist argumentation, the family is still seen as a nucleus of the state or of the nativist people. The third frame is that in this debate, men are victims. So gender equality policies, these right-wing actors claim, lead to the erosion and destruction of male identities. And for instance, Werner Reichelt, one of the Austrian protagonists of the anti-gender discourse, claims that male values such as, and I quote, heroism and competitiveness, end of quote, are endangered and men are effeminated through these gender discourse. Or, just to give you another example, not an Austrian example, the French writer Michel Houellebecq, in a talk in Berlin last year, he said that Western societies are trying to, how he coined it, eradicate masculinity, end of quote. So the fourth frame is anti-intellectualism, because these actors say that gender studies, of course, is a waste of money, a waste of tax money. It's a rather unnecessary discipline at universities, and it serves only professors, gender professors. It serves only the academic elite. That's why they are against it. And the fifth frame is anti-elitism, which is, of course, combined with this. And they say that gender studies, but also gender equality policies, only serve the power claims of, as they say, and this is Andreas Unterberger, who some of you might know. He says, this only serves the power claims of, quote, a small group of radical women in universities or in politics, so end of quote. And these elite women, Unterberger goes on, do not care about, for instance, the equal pay of the small woman in the streets. The sixth and last point I would call is an anti-Islamic racist frame, or what Sarah Ferris coined a femo-nationalist frame. And what do I mean with this? While on the one hand, these actors all blame gender mainstreaming as being unnecessary, as being danger for the family, for instance, or Unterberger, he says gender mainstreaming is like in state socialism, a top-down policy instrument. But on the other hand, when it comes to migrant communities and to migrant women, they blame, of course, the inequality of migrant communities and criticizing that these communities are patriarchal, are violent against women, for instance. And of course, they do this in order to prove that especially Muslim migrants do not fit to Western society or to the Austrian society. And this is what Sarah Ferris means with femo-nationalism. So by promoting these arguments, the anti-gender discourse creates an all-encompassing narrative about an existing threat to mainstream society, a threat, for instance, by feminist elites, by homosexuals, and by migrants. And of course, this narration being threatened by the other or by the elite feeds again into the right-wing discourse of a we against the other. So we could say that this anti-genderism is a sort of identity politics. And the background of this right-wing identity politics, which uses anti-gender as an empty signifier, the background are fundamental changes. And these changes can be summarized as precarization of labor and life, of rising social inequality and insecurity, and of course, of as a loss in trust to the political elites. So growing social insecurity is a reality mainly for working people who once profited from the Keynesian welfare state and now have been hit by cuts in social welfare and by rising unemployment. And right-wing populists do answer to these transformations. They give a rather specific answer because they try to shift these precarity, these insecurity in another direction. They shift the issue of social inequality towards the exclusion of migrants. And the anti-gender discourse is another facet in this re-signification process and in a process of publicly negating social inequality as a problem. The anti-gender discourse dramatizes the restructuring of the welfare state, the cut in the welfare state, as a crisis of masculinity. And while, of course, it is true that the male breadwinner, for instance, is eroding in Western European society, but nevertheless, the right-wing anti-gender discourse strategically confounds the causes for the erosion of the male breadwinner and the consequences, namely blaming, for instance, women for this transformation. Thus, anti-genderism is part of the political rights struggle for hegemony and for political power all over Europe. A struggle which I would say fundamentally challenges social equality, non-discrimination, and self-determination. And Stuart Hall called this, I think 20 years ago, authoritarian populism. So I would say that the anti-gender debate feeds into the development of an authoritarian populism, which strives, for instance, for the renaturalization of the social order, and which wants to delegitimize not only liberal democracy, but which wants to delegitimize democracy as self-determination, for instance, of the people. And in this discourse, democracy, in the right-wing discourse, and in the anti-gender discourse, democracy seems rather impossible, not only due to the natural inequality of the people. This is one argument. They say people are unequal, and that's why they can't determine themselves. But democracy seems impossible due to the notion of the people. And in these right-wing anti-gender discourse, the people is constructed as a victim of corrupt elites, of intellectuals, of mainstream media, and that's why the people as a victim of these groups needs protection, and the people needs leadership. And of course, the leaders are right-wing populist parties. Thus, the anti-gender discourse serves as a focus of right-wing forces to use the crisis of democracy in Europe to push their authoritarian project further. And one could say that, this is the cuckoo now, and one could say that gender serves as a sort of discursive element in this struggle. So in light of these discourses, I would suggest, or it's difficult to suggest at all feminist counter strategies, and I hope that the two colleagues on the panel will have more of these examples. I want to give two examples, and the first example I want to give is the women's referendum 2.0, which was launched in April this year, and it was launched at the 20 years jubilee after the first Austrian women's referendum in 1997. The women's referendum is a counter strategy against neoliberalism, which works within the established political system by using the Austrian constitutional instrument of a referendum. But with few exceptions, referenda in Austria have not been successful in terms of changes of laws, for instance, or changes of policies. But nevertheless, the women's referendum 2.0 aims foremost at creating a public discourse and wants to create public awareness for a feminist backlash in a neoliberal area, as the organizers declared in their press conference in April when they launched the referendum. And the organizers detect a sexist backlash since 2016, and they explicitly refer, of course, to Donald Trump's legitimation of sexual harassment, but they also refer to sexism during the presidential election in Austria. And also, they focus on, for instance, traditional gender and women's roles. They also focus on the huge gender pay gap in Austria. And the referendum includes 15 demands which focus on work, on family, on health, and political participation. One of the demands is, for instance, the reduction of weekly working hours, or another is free contraceptives, and another demand is a 50% quota for elections. And of course, this referendum immediately provoked right-wing anti-gender reactions. Carmen Schimanek from the Austrian FPÖ identified the women's referendum as, how she wrote, gender ideology, which will enter Austrian schools. And she thus claimed, and I quote, boys should be boys and girls should be girls, end of quote. And maybe we have time to talk little bit later about the women's referendum. So the feminist counter-strategy I want to introduce is the so-called, is an Austrian female fraternity, which labels herself Hysteria, and Hysteria is active mainly online and social media, but also offline at specific events. And Hysteria's activism works, of course, outside the established political channels, using artist activism to provoke and to gain public attention. Hysteria challenges the masculinity of male bonding within male fraternities, and these male fraternities in Austria are, of course, very well connected with the right political spectrum, and especially with the FPÖ. So most of the FPÖ party officials in Vienna are recruited from these male fraternities, of course not from Hysteria. So, but the female members of the fraternity, they are wearing, as you can see, black uniforms, red berets, and their logo is a hyena, a harpy, which are said to violent female packs. One of the female-only members of Hysteria is Stefanie Sargnagel, an Austrian writer who was awarded a prize at the Klagenfurt Literature Competition in 2016. And rather often she is the target of right-wing verbal attacks. Hysteria ridicules the normalcy of male rituals in Austrian society and in Austrian politics. Instead of drinking together, Hysteria suggests to menstruating together and to synchronize the menstrual cycle of all women. Moreover, the proclaimed aim of Hysteria is to, and I quote from the website, to protect our men on the way towards the golden matriarchy, end of quote. These protective measures for men include the restriction of men's suffrage or the advice for men not to be alone in the streets at night. As an answer to the right-wingers' refusal of gender quota, Hysteria demands women and transgender quota of 80% in the public service. In February 2017, this year, Hysteria participated in the Vienna Academic Ball, a ball for an international right-wing elite organized by the Freedom Party, and Hysteria renamed this ball to Ball for the Protection of Men. And I think although Hysteria is a rather small art project, it is able to satirize the masculinism of the right. And I would just give a small example of this ball I already mentioned. Okay.
Es ist ein langer Weg. Das wissen auch die Mitglieder der Burschenschaft
Does it work?
Hysteria. Laut Eigendarstellung wurde sie bereits 1810 gegründet, zunächst als Geheimloge im Umfeld der Kaiserin Leopoldine. Bis heute kämpft Hysteria mit der Macht des Uterus für das goldene Matriarchat.
Nach langem schweren Leiden ist es an der Zeit, die entseelte Hülle des verblichenen Patriarchats feierlich zu Grabe zu tragen.
Die Burschenschaft Hysteria würde natürlich abstreiten, dass sie ein Satireprojekt sind, sondern dass es ihnen todernst ist. Sie halten natürlich den männlichen Burschenschaften einfach den Spiegel vor. Und man merkt auch an der Reaktion von denen, dass die überhaupt nicht damit umgehen können. Die wissen, die haben keine Worte, die haben keine Sprache für das, was ihnen da passiert. Und das ist eigentlich das Schöne an dem Ganzen, mal Rechte sprachlos zu sehen.
Und weil sie selbst sprachlos sind, müssen sie sich von der Polizei schützen lassen. So geschehen beim traditionellen Herbstbummel der schlagenden Burschenschaften bei der Wiener Uni.
Ich bin vom Verfassungsschutz und bin hier verantwortlich für die Demonstration. Sie sind Teil einer untersagten Demonstration und deswegen kommen Sie hier.
Gewaltbereit scheint sie auch zu sein, die Hysterie, wie diese Fotostrecke von der Inbesitznahme einer Burschenbude belegt. Und auch beim umstrittenen Akademikerball in der Hofburg mischen sie auf ungebührliche Art und Weise mit. Was die Hysterie antreibt, ist kein Männerhass, ganz im Gegenteil.
Wir sind eben für Konservatismus in dem Sinn, dass Männer sich wieder auf ihre häuslichen Pflichten konzentrieren sollten, Rückzug aus dem öffentlichen Raum, auch vom Wahlrecht merkt man, sie sind eigentlich davon überfordert. Also auf Bezirksebene finden wir es angebracht, auf Landesebene eher nicht.
Ach, dürften doch nur die Frauen wählen. Die Welt sehe wahrscheinlich freundlicher aus.
Okay, thank you.
Vielen Dank, Birgit Sauer, für diese. Sorry, I switched to English again. My mistakes. Thank you very much for this accurate analysis, political and discourse analysis, and also for these very current examples of feminist collectivism in Austria. I think we will have the opportunity to discuss this later because it's. I think you have questions and comments on that. I have prepared questions too, but I'll leave them for later. Also. Regarding the time. And I would like to move on to our next speaker because we have two more speakers and we also want you to speak. So it's my pleasure to introduce Kate Lappin, who came from far away from Chiang Mai, Thailand, where she works as regional coordinator for the Asia-Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development. And this network encompasses 20 women's rights organizations and activists from around 26 countries in this region, in the Asia-Pacific region. And Kate has worked for 20 years in the promotion of women's rights, including with Amnesty International, a state equal opportunity and human rights commission in Australia, which is also her country of origin, and the trade union movement she has worked with for quite a long time. Kate has taught in several universities in the field of law, women's rights and human rights, and she is also a member of different bodies. I'll mention a few. The UN Women's Asia Pacific Civil Society Advisory Committee, the Executive Committee of the Women Human Rights Defenders International Coalition, and the Coordinating Committee of the Southeast Asian Women's Caucus. And we have met at the AVID Forum in Brazil in September last year, where she spoke about the global dominance of corporate or neoliberal capitalism. And I was very impressed, first about her enthusiasm, and second about her theoretical and also analytical skills, especially in explaining very complex issues related to trade, finance, taxes, also to non-experts. So she's very good at that, and that's why I invited her, actually. But it was not so easy to bring her here, because she said one of her preconditions is also to give her the opportunity to mobilize feminists in Austria. And that's why we have organized a workshop, which will take place tomorrow. So you can still register for it, and you are welcome to do so. So Kate will bring in a feminist analysis of the corporate capture of the state, which is threatening the exploitative economy and severe labor rights labor rights violations, and she will then also present feminist strategies developed by her organizations and other social movements. The floor is yours. Okay.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you to Nadia and to Wide and VRDC for inviting me. I'm really pleased to be here, and it's been a great opportunity for me to actually learn a little bit more about what's happening in Europe, because being Asia Pacific focused, we are following, the rise, particularly here, of the global rise, but particularly the European experience of authoritarianism and right-wing politics. But I don't have, the really close analysis that we've just heard. And before I start, it reminded me hearing about particularly the rise of the discourse around families and the positioning of family as the core political player of an area that we had done some campaigning around. 2 years ago, there were 2 resolutions at the Human Rights Council, and it's quite illustrative for us, for APWLD, about the fact that we don't have any countries really advocating for women's human rights. Because on one day, there was one resolution about the family put by Russia and Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and a number of allies to pass a resolution arguing that the family is the core of human rights, and that there is a particular understanding of the family only, of men and women that marry, and that this is a functional society. And there was another resolution on that day for a binding instrument to regulate transnational corporations and the human rights violations that they commit. And there was not one single country that voted for the transnational corporation resolution and against the family resolution. And so we could see this global split. And we were arguing at the time that means there is no country that supports women's human rights. We can't see only those who stood up against the family resolution and argued, for example, I think it was the British Prime Minister at the time said no one can look their daughter in the eye after having voted for this family resolution. And our argument was that's true, but no one can also look their daughter in the eye and argue that we don't have to regulate transnational corporations, because women are experiencing extreme violations at the hands of a global economic system in the hands of corporations. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about that aspect, although at APWLD we try and look at the nexus between globalisation, fundamentalisms, militarism and patriarchy, and we argue that they're all closely connected. So the current moment, I think, that we're probably all familiar with is one of rising global inequality and severe climate disaster that is interlinked. These are some of the statistics you can see around how unequal the world currently is. Of course, there's quite a famous finding annually of how concentrated wealth is in the hand of a tiny minority. And it's quite shocking that since this statistic was collected, it's gone from 300 people that own as much wealth as the bottom 50% of the world to now 8. So it shows that just in the last few years, wealth is concentrating further and further. That corporations now have far more power than most countries. 10 corporations are richer than 180 countries combined. And this is demonstrated particularly in the Asia Pacific region, where growth in inequality has been particularly large. But how did that happen? I think this is something that's really important for us to understand, that this isn't an accident, and this is actually very new. If we understand that it's very new, we can also see that the current economic system is not one that's natural, that it actually was designed and that it can be challenged. So I just wanted to start with a little bit of history about the post-war era, because as was mentioned in the post-war Keynesian welfare era, that really was a time of reducing inequality. And that's both reducing inequality between countries and within countries, because it was also an era of decolonisation. And that was quite concerning to the people that have been accustomed to having a lot of political and economic power. And it's incidentally, both the rise of neo-fascism and the rise of neoliberalism can both be tracked back to this period. In fact, during the Second World War, where it was the period where some of the global institutions were set up of neoliberalism, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And after that period in the 60s and 70s, where there was quite reduced inequality and power of the labour movement, there was a concern by the American Chamber of Commerce that really they'd lost political power and they were losing their economic power. And there was this memo which you can read about, you can actually access this memo even though they've tried to shut it down many times. It's called the Powell Memo, and it's a memo about how to restore the power of corporations and the wealthy. And if you look through it, you'll see that there's really clear plan to be where we are now. It includes ensuring that political parties take donations and will therefore need to do the bidding of corporations. It includes ensuring that academia is also funded not by the state but by private enterprise and reducing the power of independent academia. It includes having extreme media power and ensuring that again, media matches the interests of the wealthiest. It looks at how to reduce the power of labour and increase a global system and a global agreement that will give power to the wealthiest. And that, of course, has happened. That's happened through a number of mechanisms. One way has been through indebting countries. So, of course, once many countries became indebted, they surrendered their sovereign power. And another way has been through the general idea of economics, getting people to vote for GDP and believe that the growth of the nation's capital or wealth is an indication of their well-being. And then finally, of course, there's the trade agreements, which I wanted to talk about a little bit more, and the way that trade has actually taken away the capacity of the state to meet its human rights obligations. And just a little bit about that history. It may not be, I'm sure there's an increasing awareness in Europe about trade agreements and impact it has on people's human rights, but it may not be as well known that the origin, particularly of the investor protections that appear in trade agreements, what's called the investor-state dispute settlement, was a European invention to protect the colonial investments. And it was designed by Deutsche Bank, and they called it the Magna Carta for investors. So, of course, the rights, so this idea that they needed their protection. The very first case, the very first time a corporation was able to sue a government was in Sri Lanka, where a British man had investments in the fishing industry, and during the war, the period of war with the Tamil and Tamil sort of fighters, he lost part of his fishing industry. Now, everybody was losing, of course, everybody was losing their livelihoods, their lives, their land, but he was able to sue the government. Well, the government was also fighting against the Tamils, but he argued in the international dispute process that his investment wasn't properly protected by the government. And so I think one of the really critical issues that has not had as much perhaps attention globally is the way that this has led to a growth of inequality between countries. There's some sort of idea that the usual powers, the northern powers of Europe and the US and Australia and others, have lost that power. But in fact, if we really look into it, the wealth of these countries is dependent on the poverty of other countries. And perhaps taking particularly China out of the equation, but inequality between the wealthiest countries and the least wealthy countries has actually grown. And how that's done, of course, we know that the UN actually was based on solidarity and the idea that wealthy countries had to provide solidarity, and one method of solidarity was aid. And we get a lot of attention about aid, but that really is dwarfed by the other sources of money coming out of those countries. And through, for example, trade mispricing, the way that mispricing and misinvoicing means that you can manufacture the way that your profits in one country are shifted to a tax haven or to other locations and other registered bodies, and you won't have to leave any funds in that country through tax. Of course, through debt, and the amount that's serviced through debt, that just the interest, let alone the repayments, is far greater than aid, and through other trade rules. So that is around $2 trillion every year is moved from poorer countries to richer countries. And one of the key features of globalization has been the desire to source cheap labour, the desperate search around the world for the cheapest, most exploitative labour. And that has mostly been of women. The rise of, the rise of Asia, or the Asian miracle, has been mostly because of the access to the very low pay of women, as well as women's unpaid labour. You can see here, for example, how much the minimum wage is in countries in Asia, particularly export countries that are dependent on export industries. So Bangladesh and Myanmar or Burma and Sri Lanka, all of them have a large garment industry as one of their main export industries, and all of them are getting off per month around $68 per month for that work, which is, of course, it's a lower cost of living, but it is nowhere near a living wage. We would calculate that at the minimum would be something like $200 just to survive, just to have half your income on food for your family and another half on non-food costs. The amount being paid goes up slightly as industries become more industrialized. So countries like China are slowly moving into more industrialized industries, but what usually happens then is this is a more male-dominated industry. So as they move away from garments, for example, into manufacturing cars, like has happened in Thailand, you might find a higher wage. But this, I think, if we look at what this actually means, those women's labour is actually making other people enormously wealthy. In 1965, the ratio between a CEO's salary and a worker's salary was about 1 to 20. And at that time, actually, the labour movement said that was obscene. It should be about 1 to 7. Now, within the same corporation, it's 1 to 300. But that really masks what's really happening, because if you think of the fact that a garment worker was once employed in the same place as the CEO, and at that point it was 1 to 20, but now you can see here the owner of Zara, for example, has 82 million times the wealth or income of a garment worker, and even the CEO of something like JCPenney, these are both corporations that manufacture in Bangladesh, that person's income is 65,000 times higher than one of the workers. So this is a huge disparity in global income. These are all part of a system that is robbing individuals depending on their labour, but also robbing the country of its capacity to really deliver social services. And one way that's done is through tax avoidance, and we know, of course, now that we've got much more information about the amount of money that's sitting in tax havens, which is up to $30 trillion worldwide. $30 trillion is the kind of money that really could shift the whole global economy if it was used properly for things like addressing the climate crisis. It's about 1/10 of the world's financial wealth is actually sitting in these havens. I wanted to go back a little bit to the trade agreements. I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to very briefly touch on this, but we can come back to it in discussion. The rise of you see this top chart here, is the rise of the number of trade agreements around the world. So really we're growing in terms of the number and the number of countries involved. There's almost no country now that doesn't have some kind of neoliberal trade agreement. There are a couple of campaigns that we have in the region, and you might not be familiar with the largest trade agreement in the world is being negotiated at the moment. It's called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And we had this campaign against the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which you might be more familiar with, that is now on hold because of Donald Trump. But I think what's really key about these trade agreements is that they've taken away the capacity for states, even if they wanted to actually try and legislate in the interests of human rights and women's rights, or for those countries to deliver social services, or to challenge the concept of neoliberalism. You can see just the one trade agreement, the US claimed 18,000 taxes and tariffs would be eliminated by having the trade agreement. And there was all sorts of new chapters, nothing to do with trade, things about signing a seeds convention that prohibits people from sharing seeds was a requirement of that trade agreement. The requirement to corporatise the state-owned enterprises in countries like Vietnam was a part of that trade agreement. Oh, sorry. Okay, and then briefly I mentioned the investor-state dispute settlement, but I might just give you a couple of examples of them. Here, I'm sure you've heard a number of these, but really if you look where the most of the investor-state disputes is mainly between wealthy countries and developing countries. You've probably heard about some here, but a Swedish corporation suing Germany, for example, but really some of the most pernicious are those that are taking away the right of developing countries to legislate in protection of the environment, for example, and these are billions of dollars where countries have tried to say our water is now so deeply polluted we have to close down the mines, or we have to have this cleaned up. So the example with Chevron there, $9.5 billion. But in other areas, for example, 25 countries have already been sued for their taxes. So just to try and collect taxes, or to increase taxes, or to ask a corporation to pay its capital gains tax fairly, the countries are being sued for doing that. They're also being sued for things like a minimum wage, introducing a higher minimum wage. Egypt is facing a case. And South Africa faced a case for its affirmative action laws. And I think Feminist is really important when we're arguing for affirmative action, that you can be faced with a corporation challenging that concept. So these are really critical, I think, areas for us to look at because it's quintessentially the cementing of neoliberalism. Now, finally, I just wanted to touch on the positives, because it is so really negative and devastating when you think about the state we're in. The positives, what is happening that we can be part of? With the workshop tomorrow, I'm hoping that those of you that come can really think this through in a bit more detail. Because I think at the very heart of what we need to do is recognise that globalisation was only possible because corporates globalised and had solidarity. There was a solidarity of corporations and the wealthy, but we didn't have globalisation of solidarity between people. Neoliberalism depended on the corroding the labour movement, for example, so that we really need to respond to the globalisation of capital with the globalisation of movements. And that's where the global strike comes in, and hoping to talk about that a bit more tomorrow. But there are some other movements, like a global tax body, that a number of countries have been working towards and really trying to get through the UN, and not successful yet, but there are steps going ahead. And I mentioned the treaty to regulate transnational corporations. And of course, there's many now movements against trade agreements, and I think Europe's probably ahead on that, but needs to see this as also the potential for solidarity with other countries, because there are a number of trade agreements the EU is negotiating with individual countries. For example, EU-India is a very dangerous one. So there's a number of ways to get involved, not just in those ones that are really clearly affecting Europe itself. But also I think that this particular climate moment is a moment that is forcing people to rethink the economic model we have, and that can be done because of course we cannot simply go on with the consumption and production we have, but it should be done in ways that really thinks about both what it means to reshape the economy for women and what it means to reshape the economy and the imbalanced economy we have between rich and poor countries. And that's where this concept of a feminist fossil fuel-free future, which is a bit of a tongue twister, comes in. And I really hope that there would be some interest in this broader concept. So I think I've run out of my time, but I'm leaving you with this hopeful slide about the growth of movements and this movement towards globalising our solidarity and transnational feminism, but also transnational alliances between movements, feminist movements, climate movements, and labour movements. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate, for this very interesting input. Although we are a bit behind schedule, I would still like to ask one question referring to your slide on the different strategies. So what can we do? Because this is also the title of our panel discussion, so I would like to make a link to this and ask you, what do you think? Do we need to work on different levels, or should we prioritize? Meaning, should we first try to put pressure on governments or on the private sector, or should we try to establish a global tax body, or the financial transaction tax? And so there are so many different mechanisms and strategies, and I just wonder if you suggest, or your organization, to work on different levels with government, private sector and civil society, or do one after the other? Or what is, maybe it's a difficult question also, but.
Well, I think really we do need different strategies, and everybody is in different positions to be able to contribute. And of course, one thing I didn't talk a lot about was the political situation in Asia that often makes mobilising deadly, basically, or very extremely risky for people to mobilise against corporations or against their governments. So we do need different strategies depending on where people are and the power that they can exercise. I think that of course, some governments are more open to lobbying than others, but we've really lost the capacity to have a dialogue with governments and influence them. There's a lot of research into that shows most countries, even if they call themselves democratic, have lost the democratic space to actually lobby with, unless you can show a large amount of power. And for me, I think what's really hopeful about the last year is the mobilising that we've seen in response to authoritarianism and the capacity to actually shift things through having such a visible movement on the streets. So for me, I think that's the most promising avenue, but there is still space, particularly where governments have already been able to open a small door with the binding treaty to regulate transnational corporations. And with the leaks from, I think, the tax havens, it's really putting pressure on governments. I think it's putting quite a bit of pressure on those people who already have their money there to at least discuss this. We could see that before those leaks, most governments, especially the developed countries, wouldn't discuss the tax body, and now they're recognising that something has to change. So this is a clear combination of strategies. We need people to be leaking. I wish I could have those skills to go around and leak things or find things, but we need that kind of activism. We need people on the streets to show solidarity. We need connections, and as well as the lobbying that can happen through the UN. So yeah, very much a multiple strategy.
Thank you very much. And this leads me to one of these strategies you also presented, or it's the more activist level that we will hear from Virginia now. So Virginia Lopez Calvo is a feminist activist and advocate in transnational and intercontinental networks, particularly in the intersection of gender, economic and environmental justice. Currently she works as a campaigner for We Move Europe, which is a citizens' movement with over 640,000 supporters, campaigning for a European Union committed to social and economic justice, environmental sustainability, and citizen-led democracy. Feminist issues she deals with are the decriminalization of abortion, women's participation in macroeconomic policymaking, and trade justice. Previously, she worked with CON, the Central American Women's Network, and since 2012 also with White Plus. Virginia has also been active in the Indignados. Is it pronounced correctly?
It depends on the language, yeah.
Sorry,
yeah,
being
correct.
Italian, but still difficult. Spanish is different. Indignados, an Occupy movement that emerged in Europe in 2011 and whose outcomes are also new political directions such as Podemos, Syrian politics, and the Democracy in Europe movement 2025, for instance. And what lies in the nature of transnational feminist activism is a high level of mobility, and Virginia is a good example of that because she has migrated within Europe for 11 years, and for the past 3 she lives more of a nomad life because she travels between Rome, Madrid, Berlin, and other European cities. So Virginia will talk about transnational activism and delocalized international solidarity. And she will provide us with good practice example and show us how we as feminists can promote the access to safe and legal abortion and how we can globally mobilize for these fundamental rights, not only for Latin America, where abortion, like in many Latin American countries, abortion is often criminalized, but also for women's rights organizations in Poland, where the parliament recently, just last year, tried to put a ban on abortion, and I'm sure you have noticed that. So we are very eager to hear from your experiences, Virginia, please.
I'm aware we've been here for a while, so I'm going to try to make it short and sweet. So I'm going to speak about my own experiences of transnational solidarity, and hopefully this will be useful to address some of the very many topics we've raised today. I'm going to divide them into 2 categories. I'm not trying to theorize too much, but just for the sake of clarity. I've called the first delocalized action and the second transnational solidarity action, and you'll see what I mean as we go along. As delocalized action, what I mean is that type of solidarity you do for your own kind, for your own people at home, but you do it from abroad. So it's still beyond borders, but you do it for your own people. This is obviously the solidarity of migrants. Why am I bringing this up? Because I've been one for a long while, I've met many, and I found this very particular. I'm going to use the example of how lots of people migrated away from their countries to other European countries, but also to countries elsewhere as a result of the crisis that hit us in Europe in 2010. As a result of this crisis, we also had the movements that Nadia mentioned before, the Indignados, that were more present in Spain, Greece, France, Portugal, peripheral countries, and the Occupy movements. Both evolved in a number of hundreds of self-organized assemblies. These assemblies were dedicated to either self-care, political discussion, organized action, even sometimes management of local affairs. And I traveled between them, wide and broad. I noticed always that feminist perspectives were missing. Surprise, surprise. And when these were mentioned, it was in a rather tokenistic way. Yeah, I won't have time to go into detail to explain why this conclusion, but believe me, it was very sad to see hundreds of newly politicized people, men and women alike, fighting back every time a feminist like myself would say, how about gender analysis? How about this feminist perspective? That is secondary. Let's focus on what matters. I'm going to take the example of the London Indignados Assembly because I was very active in that particular one. It took for this assembly 2 years to build a feminist space. I was part of this assembly at the beginning. I remember telling them, why don't we have this feminist space? Why don't we start thinking about women-only issues? Because as you can see in our assembly dynamics, men speak a lot more than women. Why would that be? Women weren't interested. It took us 2 years. Eventually we got there. Here they are. These are the women of the Women's Assembly of the London's Assembly. And I want to give an example of how they engaged from 2013 in delocalized action. They're all Spanish women. You might remember that in 2013, the conservative Spanish government threatened with a new draft bill to restrict abortion rights in Spain. There were huge mobilizations in Spain and abroad, protagonized by Spanish migrants, because there were plenty of Spanish migrants abroad. And by then, we had gained feminist consciousness, hallelujah. The London Assembly, the Women's Assembly in London, came up with this project called My Belly is Mine. It's a very bad translation of a very good Spanish slogan. The tagline is, as you can read, keep abortion safe and legal in Spain. UK feminist action in solidarity with Spanish women. The mobilization was mostly of Spanish migrants, and they also successfully mobilized British, but also Irish women, because you probably know that it is a very relevant topic for Irish women. The project was mostly focused on advocacy and direct action. I've put here some pictures. I wanted to read what this banner says because it's very interesting how her story repeats herself. I won't be able to go into details as to, how come every 20 or 30 years we have to defend exactly the same things. And I wasn't there back then, but this banner reads, in 1981, 21,000 Spanish women came to the UK for abortion. Soon their daughters might be doing the same. Back then, the same kind of delocalized action took place, exactly the same, very interesting. I just wanted to give another example of another women's assembly that arose from an Indignados group in Berlin. They set up a different project called the Federica Montseny Network, which instead of focusing on advocacy and direct action, focused on direct support. So they set up 10 nodes in 10 different countries in Europe and Latin America to give direct support to those women who would have had to travel abroad. So they put together funding, they put together analysis of legal national contexts, they put together guides and little networks where these women would be able to travel, stay, get guidance, support, including financial, and have abortions outside Spain. Good news is that justice was restored. The mobilizations at home and abroad, with all the solidarity sent from abroad, had an impact. The minister that protagonized this draft bill had to step down. He gave up his parliamentary seat and he even quit politics altogether. We're talking about a man who is or used to be an iconic figure of the conservative right wing in Spain. So he took a huge toll. I just wanted to, this is a headline from a media article where he says, "I have not been able to fulfill my duty." No, you weren't. And moving on to what I call transnational solidarity, so the kind of solidarity one engages, it's not solidarity you send back home, it's solidarity you send somewhere else. And I wanted to illustrate this through my experience with the Central America Women's Network, which is an organization that sadly had to close a few months ago due to lack of funding for feminist organizations. For us, it was always very important to try and revert It doesn't go backwards. It does. To try and revert the usual relation between North and South-based NGOs, where the former take a bit more the lead, and because we have the funding, we decide more or less what the projects look like and what are the priorities and what's the discourse about and We always tried to sit down, listen to our sisters in Central America and hear what their priorities were, what their discourses were, the timelines, what sort of policy intervention they needed us to work on and follow their lead. This is what I call amplifying their voices. So being a megaphone for them in places where their voices do not exist. I just wanted to use the example of a campaign called Las 17, you might have heard of. It's translated as the 17, from a Salvadoran coalition of feminist organizations. The situation as it regards access to abortion in El Salvador is quite dire. It's very dramatic. Not just in El Salvador, in most Central American countries and in some Latin American countries is also the case. We're talking about a context where there are high levels of rape and therefore high levels of unwanted and forced pregnancy. Very quickly, the second reason for maternal mortality in El Salvador is suicide, because young women are raped, then forcefully pregnant, and they don't want to have the child, and they kill themselves. We also talk about a context where there is very limited access to prenatal care, particularly for poorer women, who are always the ones criminalized, or most of the time. We're talking about a country where abortion is not just socially stigmatized, but also legally banned in all circumstances. So whether it's therapeutic, eugenic, or ethical, you cannot have an abortion to save your life. Women have died as a result of the government not letting them have an abortion. By the way, this has happened in Ireland 3 years ago as well. So in this context of, let me add as well, of state surveillance, where doctors are forced to, you want to say something? No. Where doctors are forced to denounce cases of abortion. The result is that hundreds of women are imprisoned. So, yeah, our campaign, and I think I'm not doing great with time, our campaign was about basically unfolding or running this campaign in Europe, or rather in the UK, which was our area of our mandate. Let me move on. Something else we did to try and amplify their voices was to help globalize something we think is very important, the Latin American Day of Action for Access to Safe and Legal Abortion. This is a mobilization strategy to transform society's understanding of abortion as well as laws. Latin American feminists came up with this strategy years ago. And now, not just ourselves, not just the Central America Women's Network, many other feminists are trying to help globalize it. Our contribution is the Festival of Choice. It's basically a program of activities with a rather celebratory, light-touch tone, because from the beginning we wanted to reach out to the not so converted, to people who perhaps aren't so aware of this topic. And for that purpose, yeah, we've tried to do something more like a festival. We also always strived to connect what happens here being Europe, with what happens there, because solidarity is much more easily expressed when you can show empathy, when you feel you're in a similar position to the other, when you don't feel, oh, that's something that happens to not so very civilized people. When you realize you are under the same systems of oppression, the same populisms, in our case, Christian populisms. Some pictures from the festival, from the last edition, which has run for 3 years now, 2014, 15, and 16. This will be the 4th edition, which we want to make a bit more transnational, because it's been running in London up to this point. So this year we've convinced a group of feminists to also run it in Madrid, which is going to happen, and I'm working for it to happen in Warsaw as well. And guess what? This is when I ask you to please make it happen in Vienna. It happens on the 28th of September. We have an instructions pack, which I won't have time to show you, which is a bit more basic, but I'm also happy to meet you and talk to you if you're interested in learning more about what is this festival about, how does it work, why is it impactful, and how we can connect all the cities. How am I doing with time? Bad. Okay, so I will move straight on to another different type of transnational solidarity, which is the one that keeps me the busiest these days, which is digital activism. 2 years ago, you asked me what digital activism is. I wouldn't have known, other than, of course, it happens in the internet. But now I work for this organization called We Move Europe, which I will speak more about tomorrow in the workshop. I just wanted to say, I think feminisms and feminist causes can really benefit from using this growing model of activism. I know there are strong reservations because I know there are organizations who have misused it. And I'm very happy to explain why there are ways of using this model that are better. In any case, let me briefly outline the potential benefits of this model of activism for us, for feminists. One of my concerns, as you've probably noticed this far, is to reach out to people who are not activists, hardcore activists, who are not converted, who might be potentially understanding of our causes, and yet might not have neither the commitment or the time or the mobility, or they might not like this activist label we give ourselves, this feminist label we give ourselves. This model allows for a much wider outreach and a growing outreach as well. It's also useful because it allows for multiple actions to happen within a single space. So you can learn about things and educate, and at the same time, people can show support, and there are different levels of engagement. Yes, I know signing a petition is not the most committed thing on earth, but at least you've started somewhere. You can also spread the word and get your circles to know about the topic, and you can fund the cause, which is very important for feminists. As you know, we lack funding all the time. Why else is digital activism quite useful? Because it's nimble. It is quick. It's not very resource consuming. As you know, we live in a fast-paced world. Of course, systems of oppression are structural, they're always there. The symptoms are different. What happens in the surface is different, and this is fast-moving. And in my view, to address what is underlying, we have to start from somewhere, and that's the surface. So digital activism it lends itself quite well to react quickly to new policy developments. It also facilitates direct communication with people. So it's not like a conversation between you and I in a coffee shop, but it's not just unilateral. In our case, for instance, we do ask weekly to samples of our list, how do they feel about a particular campaign, what sort of framing they think it's appropriate, even what do they think about the union, what ways forward for the union, what do they think, we ask Spanish people what do they think about the Austrian situation, we ask Polish people what do they think about the Irish situation, making people think about things beyond their borders. It's a way of activism. And to end, I just wanted to give an example focusing again on abortion, of what can be done with a very simple kind of campaign that can be done through digital activism. When the Polish engaged in this Black March last year to fight back, again, a threat to their abortion rights, we were aware that very few people outside Poland would know about this. Not even, I've asked feminists in Spain, many did not know about this, let alone the general public. So we tried and did our bit to inform those nearly 700,000 people who are with us about the struggles of these women. We also put together a solidarity letter, which nearly 86,000 people signed. So I'm talking about citizens, people who are not activists. And then we published this on Polish media, and we sent it to feminist groups in Poland as a show of solidarity. We wanted them to know people outside your country care and support what you're doing. We also raised well, people raised money for Polish feminists, and they put together 16,000, I think that figure is outdated, but anyway, they put together between 16 and 20,000 euros, which we then transferred to feminist Polish groups. We've also worked on other feminist causes. For instance, we've worked with the European Women Lobby on the Istanbul Convention and its ratification by the European Union, which they've announced last week, which is another victory. And I think I'm just going to leave it here because I don't think I'll have time to explain this now. Okay.
Many thanks, Virginia, for this insight in this transnational and digital feminist activism. Virginia will also be with us tomorrow with the workshop, so she can again explain the latest case for the right to abort. I would like now to open the discussion and to ask you what you think about the strategies that you have heard, if you have other or new ideas, or any type of questions, comments you would like to make to the panelists. And I would like to open this discussion with a question: how can we democratize our governments? Which is actually a quote from Madeleine Rees from the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which I think brings it to the point, and I found it very useful for myself. So I will collect 2-3 questions, comments from you, and please mention to whom you are addressing them. And you have the possibility to speak either in English or German, so feel free to talk German as well. We have interpretation, but just make sure to use the microphone so that our international guests can get the interpretation. We have a mobile microphone over there. 2, we have 2, sorry, one here, one there. So please. Go ahead.
Danke, also ich würde gerne auf Deutsch sprechen. Was ihr jetzt, also danke für die vielen Informationen und Inputs, waren sehr schöne Vorträge. Was mir jetzt noch ein bisschen gefehlt hat, waren eben wirklich konkrete Strategien gegen Neoliberalismus. Ich denke nämlich, dass die gesamte Gesellschaft global gesehen von einer neoliberalen Rationalität geprägt ist, wo man sehr schwer ausbrechen kann. Und ich glaube, es gibt halt vielleicht einen Ansatz, der von einer Wahrnehmungsrevolution ausgeht, wo man sagen muss, man muss politische Räume, öffentliche Räume etablieren, wo Menschen sich austauschen, wo Meinungsvielfalt, Wertepluralismus anerkannt wird, wo wirklich Meinungen aufeinanderprallen, wo die Konflikthaftigkeit der Demokratie anerkannt wird. Und insofern kann man vielleicht Sprech- und Handlungsräume schaffen, wo wirklich konkrete Strategien irgendwie zugelassen werden, wodurch es dann auch vielleicht zu einer Wirklichkeitsrevolution kommt. Wobei ich sagen muss, ich glaube weder an Revolution noch an Reform, weil Revolution in unserem Sinne ja immer ein Aufstand von Massen ist, und das ist in den konkreten Herrschaftsverhältnissen auf unserer Welt nicht möglich, glaube ich, weil die Macht so ungleich verteilt ist. Reform ist auch total, Entschuldigung übrigens, dass meine Stimme so zittert, ich bin sehr aufgeregt. Reform ist, glaube ich, auch kein Ansatz, weil das immer innerhalb des Systems dann funktioniert. Da gibt es ja viele Beispiele, vielleicht ganz kurz. Die Finanzmarktrichtlinie von 2014, die versucht hat, die Nahrungsmittelspekulationen einzudämmen und Grenzwerte, die aber total ineffektiv sind, eingeführt hat. Das ist einfach, weil Wirtschaft und Politik so miteinander verzahnt ist und Machtverhältnisse da sind, die nicht so einfach durchbrochen werden können. Also, um auf den Punkt zu kommen, ich glaube, es ist extrem schwierig, Massen zu mobilisieren und wirklich einen Umbruch herbeizuführen. Aber wo ich glaube, dass man ansetzen kann, ist, dass man wirklich aktiv öffentliche Räume schafft, wo Menschen wieder zur Partizipation aufgefordert werden, wo das war sie schon. Ich halte mich jetzt so kurz. Dankeschön.
War das jetzt nur ein Kommentar oder haben Sie auch eine Frage?
Ja, schon.
An eine der Referentinnen?
Ja, also vielleicht an alle.
An alle?
Ja.
Schwierig.
Oder vielleicht an Professorin Sauer, weil ich auch am Institut für Politikwissenschaften bin und weil es konkret vielleicht auch um österreichische Strategien jetzt geht, die man vielleicht einsetzen könnte. Gibt es von feministischer Seite vielleicht Strategien oder Ansätze, die Demokratie theoretisch, aber auch praktisch versuchen zu agieren, also performativ in Aktion zu treten? Da wäre ich gespannt.
Frage? Ja? Okay. Bitte. Thanks for your presentations. I just have a few comments and questions. First of all the talk, like feminist talks that I've been to, the majority of panelists are women. I don't know whether it's a bit depressing or not, but the majority of the panelists are women. Secondly, I've heard from your presentations that you use a lot, like many times, the word solidarity. For me, solidarity always implies exclusion of another group. So when you talk about solidarity, is solidarity between a group, like for members of a group, so it somehow always implies the exclusion of another group. Third, I'm curious about your strategies regarding the way of communicating with anti-feminist groups or anti-gender inequality groups. How do we use their language to communicate our perceptions, our ideologies that gender equality is something that we should strive for? Thank you.
Thank you. One question over there.
First of all, thanks to all three of you for your very, very insightful and interesting presentations. I would like to ask, I think it was Mrs. Lappin, a question. Was it Lappin? Okay. We've often heard the sentiment, well, sexism and how men used to treat women, it's a thing of the past, and that the current generation of young people is going to change all of that. Sexism is, in young people, it's just not a thing that's relevant anymore. It's a thing that a majority of young people believe to be an outdated, not very useful concept. I have to say that in my everyday life, I have encountered many people that have shown me that this is simply not true. And I do think that many people here might be able to emulate. So my question would be, how can we make sure that the young people of this generation are truly integrated in the movements that strive for gender equality, and especially the men?
Good question, thank you. Okay. Okay, please.
Well, thank you very much. I was very much impressed by the presentations of the very urgent subjects about gender equality, inequality. I would like to ask whether there is anyone is on the agenda, anything on the agenda of the female migrant workers from poor countries to wealthy countries, like, for instance, let's say from Asia to the Emirates. Is there anything where the females are being so much badly exploited and have no voice to speak up and to cry out?
I think Kate can answer this question. Thank you. I have to look at the time also, so I would like to go back to the panel now, and we have 4 questions. Maybe we can start with Professor Sauer, the question about how difficult it is to mobilize masses, like, and if we need, and if it would be more beneficial to have open spaces where we can discuss about strategies, if that's a more useful strategy or measure.
Yeah, thanks for all. I think the important questions, or they are not only questions, but also contribution we should think about. And I would say, of course, there are different localities and different times, so different spaces and different times when feminists, when women's movements or democratic movements are able to be in the streets, to mobilize, let's say, masses. Just take the Polish women's movements, which has traditionally been, after 1989, very effective in mobilizing to go on the streets. They occupied the parliament in Warsaw, for instance. So, but if you look then, for instance, into Austria or Germany, there it's rather difficult to think about a feminist movement which is able to occupy streets, for instance, and then to change laws or to implement or to influence policies. So, well, I would say there is not one strategy, because it depends on space and time. And of course there are quite a few theoretical democratic theories that try to answer how can we democratize our governments. And you could say, well, we could think about the government which are elected governments on the one hand, and there it might be difficult to democratize them because elections are really very tight instrument to change something. But if we think of government in a more broader sense, if we think that all the subjects take part in how these governments work, then there might be moments and times in history where it is able to change governments. For instance, when people really feel that something is going wrong, for instance. But what we could see, that's what I wanted to make my point with the right-wing populists. They actively seek an answer to social inequality and to neoliberalism. And it's very easy, I would say, of course, wrong answer, but they have, and they can mobilize people to elections, for instance. So I would agree saying, well, we can't wait for the revolution, but we should see what is already going on. So you had so many examples what is going on. And we should then not only see that we are stuck in neoliberal right-wing extremist constellation, but that there are a lot of initiatives which are already going on, and that there is already some debate which then might, at a special time in history, lead to democratic, maybe only a small uprise, but that people see that they can't and that they do not want to live as they have been used to. And I think it's very, very difficult. If you look at universities, there are only small groups, but nevertheless, there are these small groups. So when you were talking about these revolution of the mind, or how, I don't know how you would translate it, I think it's really important to vision what could be another way of living. And if we do not have the vision how it could be, then it will never happen. So this might be very banal, but as we can't think about this big eruptive revolution, we really have to think what is already going on, how do we change our lives, how do others already do that? For instance, there is a huge vegan movement. And these vegan movement says we do not want to eat these industrialized food, for instance. And I think this might, for instance, contribute to a change of our Western lifestyle. And this might also then change all the oppression of female labor, for instance. So, but what I would say is just let's look at these small movements which are already going on. Yeah.
Thank you. There was another question on sexism, if it's a concept that has been overthrown. and that we should work on new concepts and that we should try to integrate the young generation. Apparently they don't feel integrated, or at least the person who made this comment, and especially also to integrate men. I would just like to make a small comment on that. We are also part of the Men Engage movement, Men Engage and Boys for Gender Justice, and we cooperate very closely with them, and we need more male feminists. But I'm sure someone of you, I don't know, who would like to answer this question about young generation or men.
If the question was about sexism, I think it's better for Kate to address it because it was part of your presentation. If it's more about mobilization, I can also address it. I'm not sure exactly.
Up to you.
Let me say a few words, addressing a few questions, and hopefully and then, or Kate, would you like to go first?
No, you go.
Okay. Apologies if you see me looking at my mobile. I'm actually taking notes here. I've embraced the digital era. I think someone asked about solidarity and whether that's exclusionary of groups. I just wanted to say I would equate it more to positive discrimination, with which feminists we do believe in. There are some groups which are more in need of solidarity than some others, at least as it pertains to certain topics. So I wouldn't call it exclusion, I would call it positive discrimination. And I would say, yes, that's fine. I think, as I said before, working for solidarity requires building emotional links, empathy. So yes, you have to focus on a particular target. You can't just connect to the whole world unless you're Buddha. But normally you need a subject, like a subject group to connect to. So yeah, that means you leave others out. And the questions, I think there were a couple of questions on mobilization. I wanted to say something that pertains to my own experience. When I saw the explosion of assemblies through the Indignados and Occupy movement, I thought that was the revolution coming. To me, that was what you've described. I don't know where you are. What you've described, those spaces in the streets that people went to, they got politicized, they learned from each other, they were horizontal, they touched on more profound structural topics, they touched on more concrete policies. It was wonderful, and I thought, this is what revolution looks like, we're gonna make it. We didn't, and that is why I moved on to this digital activism, and that's why my mantra now is reach out to the converted, reach out to the non-converted, reach out to the non-converted, because I saw that those assemblies from the Indignados and Occupy movements did add value to our struggle. Now there are plenty of more people like us, politicized like us, but it wasn't enough. And for a wave like what I saw back then to happen again, we need another shock, which I don't wish for, but it seems that that's when people get mobilized, when shock hits us. In the meantime, I'm relying on digital activism to make mass mobilization happen. By the way, mass mobilization doesn't have to be just taken to the streets. Mass mobilization is when a lot of people mobilize doing things. It can be in the internet, it can be in their home, it can be in a garden. It doesn't have to be in the form of demonstrations. It can even be more effective if it's not in the form of demonstrations. And I think I'm going to leave it to Kate because I've got many more ideas, but we're short of time.
Well, first on the question of, I guess, does sexism instill, and I think when you look at these issues around neoliberalism and the rise of the extreme right, we can really see that both of these are dependent on sexism actually. So the economic model that we have is dependent on the differential between the value of women and men's labour. That's why women in the global south, in Asia particularly, are able to be exploited. Their wages are so exploitable and the conditions they have. But it's also dependent on women's unpaid labour. And that is the economic model we have, that there will be somebody, a woman, who will put in the labour required to look after the community, the family, and so forth. So this is a structural form of sexism that we can see both in the economy, but also, as was mentioned earlier, for a political gain. I mean, it's not possible to have the political gain that focuses on gender without the currency of sexism. But I think that this is also really evident in the question around migrant workers, for example. If we didn't have embedded sexism, then the likelihood of women, what we call the feminization of migration, wouldn't have occurred. So for many, many women now in Asia who have been pushed off their land, for example, for many reasons, the only option left is migration. And it's the worst possible conditions you can imagine being a migrant domestic worker, because you lose the capacity for solidarity. You don't have you're not in your own country, and you can't form usually a union or get any, you're often not even counted as a worker. In most countries that migrant women are working in the Middle East, but also within Asia, they're not included under the labour code, and many countries here don't include domestic workers under the labour code, and so they're even paid less than what I was showing for garment workers. And I think this is really evident of, could we imagine that a whole range of men would migrate to become domestic workers? It's not imaginable because of sexist concepts of labour. But that's also part of, I think, the other question, which is about what can we reimagine? What kind of revolution could we have if we imagine different things? And one of those, in terms of the answer to neoliberalism, or many, many answers that we need before the revolution, is around this concept of labour. So there has been discussions about what might be called a universal basic income or a social wage. If we could reimagine what it means to work and what value we give to different forms of work, and provide this universal social income, that means we all have time to contribute, whether that contribution means to care, work for family, or whether it means to political work or work that's about sustainable living. This would be a key part of completely shifting away from the neoliberal model. And that could be, as you said, in creating spaces where it's possible to reimagine economies and the contributions we make. And there is that sort of thing happening, I think, already with, trying to recapture the commons, trying to have shared space, shared garden, sharing economy, but not in the Uber, kind of way, but in real sharing of time and resources and contributions. And even, I think, with the wave of migration, see that that's happening. Some people saying we're going to share our resources with people that are coming here. So I think that's, for me, one of the ideas around, and that is solidarity. The concept that we don't have an economy that's just built on acquisition and consumption, but that we would be more focused on sharing is solidarity. So solidarity for me isn't exclusionary at all. In fact, the concept of solidarity is very much that we will together work, and create a fairer and more just world and economy. And I think that really, if there's anyone that's excluded from that, it's the tiny minority, the 1% that are actually benefiting from the way the world works right now. And if they feel excluded, I'm okay with that, that tiny minority.
Thank you. I'm sure there is a lot more to discuss and to strategize, but we have to conclude this panel discussion because we are already 9:06. But I would like to end this panel discussion first with an announcement. So I would like to invite you again to the action workshop, which will take place tomorrow. It's called Get Ready, Mobilizing for Transnational Feminist Solidarity for Distributive Justice. It takes place in the International Institute for Peace, Möllwaldplatz in the 4th District. And Kate and Virginia will be there as resource persons, so you have, again, the possibility to discuss with them. And also Elisabeth Klatzer from Attack Austria and Femme Fiscale, and all gender, of course, are welcome. So I invite also the men in the room to join us. And I would end this panel discussion because I came across lately with a quote from Johanna Donal, who is Austria's first Minister of Women Affairs. You might not know her, but all of you in the room do. And she's still, or she was and is still a leading feminist figure. Ich denke, es ist Zeit daran zu erinnern, die Vision des Feminismus ist nicht eine weibliche Zukunft. Es ist eine menschliche Zukunft. Ohne Rollenzwänge, ohne Macht- und Gewaltverhältnisse, ohne Männerbündelei und Weiblichkeitswahn. I think this is very appropriate and still valid. Yes. Thank you. And now I invite you to continue the formal way of discussion at the bar. There are drinks will be served, and please leave the headsets on your chairs because they will be of no use outside this room. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.